Hello, welcome to this video on why study philosophy. So I thought I'd come up with some reasons of why I think you should study philosophy or why it might be a worthwhile thing to do. So, coming up first, philosophy is an answer to the summons of wonder. So this goes all the way back to Aristotle, who thought that wonder is really what gets us started with regards to philosophy. And it's not that philosophy is the only thing that answers to these summons. Um, Literature, art, science, religion, all of these things I think also are powerful in their way of answering those summons, but I think philosophy cannot be anything less than that. And in fact, usually it's like you are struck by wonder by the time you're actively engaged in philosophy. So there is this sense in which, why is the world the way it works, or is this the only way to think? Why are we self-conscious? Why is there self-consciousness in the first place in the world? And what is thought? How is it that there is a certain rationality to things, and sometimes that doesn't appear to be the case for other things, right? All of these kinds of questions prompts us with curiosity and puzzlement, but in a way that enhances our sense of our place in the world. We don't find this wonder to be a discouragement, but rather an invitation. So, what is really doing the invitation, and where are we feeling ourselves drawn towards? So, I think philosophy is a particular answer to the summons of wonder, one that takes into account that very notion that it is starting from here, and that it then builds on that and evolves. The second reason is philosophy is a discipline of thinking. Now, within this, I include things like writing, reading, listening, articulating, understanding, being able to argue and demonstrate, and to understand what is logic, formal logic, and so on and so forth. What's an inference, and all of these things. I find that all of those things come together under a certain discipline about how we are to think about things, and that we train our minds, we mold ourselves, we mold our thinking to become better at spotting biases or assumptions or things that don't have sufficient grounding, or things that are not proven. So this is the kind of mindset that is developed in philosophy, and it's something that's really hard to do. It's also very hard because it's not something that is easily spottable. Unlike if you go to the gym and work out, you see physical changes that are happening on you, and so that can be, you kind of see proof of the development there. But I think, and that's not so easily seen in somebody who's trains their thinking. But I would say that it is there in the way somebody talks about something, articulates themselves, how they spot things and think about things, in a way that should be more apparent to us than something that appears physically. So I brought out a quote here from Hegel, who points out that if philosophy lacks seriousness, suffering, and patience, labor of the negative, it becomes a kind of edification, a triteness, right? So what he's making points out for us here is that philosophy is not easy because there is learning and a lot of transforming to be done on behalf of you as a human being and as a thinker. So if it was something that simply we had from the get-go, then there wouldn't be any sort of discipline around it. But there is discipline because it's hard, because we have growth to do as thinkers. And that what Hegel also points out is that the content of what we're thinking about in philosophy, so there is this discipline I'm highlighting, but it's thinking about something specific, whether it's objectivity, self-consciousness, ethics, what's the good life, and so on, right? Ultimately, as philosophers, we need to take into account how we come to think about those things in the first place. And that makes the whole project, many times more difficult, because we constantly have to check ourselves, check how we got there, what's our starting point. As Hegel puts it here, it's the form in the essence, not just the essence as such. How did you get to that essence? How did you come to understand it in the first place? So philosophy is keenly interested in how we come to know things in the first place. How does that really work? So Hegel then stresses this, because this element is really what makes it possible to know actuality. So Wirklichkeit, right? So what's really real. And this is something that philosophers, all the great philosophers, I think, are really good at, is tapping into what's real to us, what gives us this experience, how we can figure out something to be true, what is at work in our relationships between each other and between us and nature and the world and so forth. Because I think there's, on the flip side, there is a lot of hypothetical thinking that just sets out various different examples, and they might point out some interesting things, but then there is missing this form of how they got there in that first place. And another thing about this kind of hypothetical abstract thinking is that, well, if you put in a whole bunch of conditions, why put in those conditions? Why not others? Right? You can just go on endlessly, and there is really no consequence to this kind of thinking. It becomes frictionless. You can just keep on going endlessly, and this isn't really satisfying. This isn't really has an impact on our lives as we live day to day. But I think that great philosophers are really worried about this, because the way we think, how we discipline our thinking, ultimately then goes back to reflect on the kind of lives we come to lead. So the third reason is philosophy is a critique of religion. So the religion in square quotes here I take to include religion as such, religion proper, theology and organized religion and so forth, organized faith system, beliefs and so on, ideology, worldviews, value systems, authority, and morality. So what all of these things have in common is there is a kind of metaphysical component that is presupposed or assumed, and that they are all kind of totalizing views of something, right? Morality is about human behavior and what's the right thing to do, and so on and so forth. All of these have a certain completeness to their view. It isn't localized to this or that situation. It's supposed to be universalizable and applicable everywhere. But as history often shows, the way we thought about things and what is the right thing to do kind of undermines itself, or undermines us and the kind of thing we wanted to achieve. And Nietzsche, I find, is very good at this, because he points out the kind of high-minded morality we might have about being generous and good to one another, but that it actually surreptitiously leads us into this kind of situation of resentment with one another. And so that perhaps what we thought to be the values we pursued, we thought to be good, are in fact something that is detrimental to the kind of lives we wanted to lead. So maybe there are this needs to be scrutinized and analyzed and thought about more clearly. So, and he also points out that this leads into very nasty things like nausea and ultimately nihilism. Right. So the fourth thing I wanted to point out is that there is an intellectual enjoyment to philosophy and doing philosophical activity, entering into philosophical discussions, and that there is, in principle, no limit to this activity in and for itself, neither in its form nor in its content. So I find that John Stuart Mill is very good to highlight this form of pleasure, and how this form of pleasure is something that should be celebrated and worked into as an incentive to how we think about ethics and organize our societies with one another. He stresses, right, that we have a kind of a preference to higher pleasures, ones that are more cerebral, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't indulge in more animal appetites, that we shouldn't indulge in things that pigs and other animals might also like. But just staying in that level, Mill thinks that that would be insufficient. He also goes to point out that a cultivated mind, and he says here, not just a philosopher, but why not just add a philosopher to it as well, is because that will make it all the better, is somebody who finds sources of inexhaustible interest in everything that surrounds them, be it objects of nature, achievements of art, imaginations of poetry, history, architecture, businesses, industry, politics. All of these things is something that can be of wonder and curiosity for the cultivated mind. And it is gratifying to engage in this activity. And this activity doesn't really have a limit to it. You can keep on digging deeper, because remember what Hegel said, we need to bring the form with us to the essence. And that means wherever we're going to, we also need to bring with us where we've left off. And that means we can keep on going infinitely. So I think this is a really good reason to study philosophy, is that you gain a lot of higher pleasure from it, that keeps on compounding, that keeps getting better the more you do it. So if you're having a good time reading a bit of philosophy now, it'll keep getting better. The last thing I want to point out is that, and this is a bit more technical, is that philosophy is about knowing yourself. And it's a form of a conceptual comprehension. And by knowing yourself, I don't mean in a sense that you know yourself biographically, what you ate last Monday, who you hang out with, what your hobbies are, if you like long walks on the beach and sitting and reading books in the park. It's more a knowledge of you in the universal sense of you as a self-conscious being, or as a thinker, or as the being that has the kind of experience that you have right now. And philosophy is interested in, well, what makes such kind of experiences possible? What is really happening when somebody or anything is thinking? What is the form of thought? What is the form of judgment? What is the form of self-consciousness? What is the form of the good? What is the form of right? What is the form of freedom? And it's not this or that freedom in this and that historical context, but what is logically coherent with regards to these things and topics and contents. So I'm bringing out a quote from a contemporary philosopher, Sebastian Rödl, who in this context is talking about his own book, but I think it nicely expresses the standpoint of philosophy as such, which is that it propounds no theses, advancements, or hypotheses, doesn't recommend a view or a position, doesn't give arguments to support a particular view or this or that, but it brings to explicit consciousness, as he puts it here, the self-consciousness of a judgment, or you can insert, the truth there. It brings to explicit consciousness the truth, and the truth is not something that is you can take or leave, because you have to have it with you in order to then do the kinds of things you do. And this creates an eerie situation with the nature of philosophy, the way it develops, because where you're going is arriving to where you've always been. You're making something explicit, but what you're making explicit is something you've always been having. So we're interested, well, what is thought? What is self-consciousness? Well, in order to do that, we must be self-conscious and we must be thinking. And so in a way, we already are there of where we want to be. And yet, we're not there quite there. There's still something we want to make clear to ourselves. And so knowing ourselves is to understand what is this being for which existence is a question, is a mystery, is a confusion, and then becoming clear about how such a being can find clarity, can learn, can take away this confusion. So this reason is very simple, but also extremely technical. So we are trying to become more clear about what it is we're already doing, and yet we don't have it, because if we had, we wouldn't be doing the activity that is philosophy. So this is perhaps the hardest point to get across. There is a kind of circularity to philosophy, so you're not going to learn something that you didn't already know. And yet there is something that I think changes in you as a thinker, as a human being, in making explicit what it is most close to you. And that's something that we all share. So I think this all follows along with the other points. All of these things are connected, and that ultimately, wherever mind goes, you can go there too. So there is there are no frontiers to the mind which are in principle sealed off to another mind, whether it's in mathematics or in anthropology or in climbing. Wherever mind has gone, you can go there too. And philosophers are fascinated by this element of the mind, this universality of it. And this is the kind of thing that we want to articulate, explicate, to understand, and to forever be in wonder about. So I hope that was interesting to you. Please let me know what you think. I'd be keen to hear if you think that are you persuaded by these 5 reasons? Are they good? Do you think there are better reasons we can think about when it comes to why one should study philosophy? I'm keen to hear from you, so please leave a comment, and thanks again for tuning in.